Hello, and welcome to the second lecture for business ethics. Again, my apologies for the delay in getting this lecture completed and out to you guys. My hope is over spring break to be able to catch up, and hopefully, we'll have these lectures in a more timely fashion for the second half of the semester. Um, Before we get into the lecture, a few housekeeping things. Thank you everyone for doing the bio sheets. One of the interesting comments or feedback that folks provided about what they wish their professor knew was flexibility and understanding. And I think for this semester, for this class, it'll be a two-way street for that. Hopefully you guys can be understanding and until I can get things caught up. And I hope to extend the same courtesy to you. The other thing to keep in mind is it's often helpful for me if you can communicate a bit about what's going on. So I'm always more than willing to at least entertain the option of extending a deadline or making some changes if things come up, but I need to know what's going on in order to make those adjustments. So with quiz one, the class average was a 57, and I was hoping for closer to 90%. So I'm not sure entirely what happened with quiz one. You guys have quiz two due here shortly, so hopefully those quiz grades will go up. But if they continue to kind of be in that mid to low 60 range, we might need to have a discussion about what's going on there. So for folks that are unclear about why they got a low score on the quiz, despite doing the reading and preparing for the quiz, let's connect on that and let's figure out what's going on, because we're going to have a few more of those throughout this semester. Also want you guys to know the current event assignments, the instructions, and the schedule have been posted. The first current events are going to be due this week. So take a look at that, see when you're presenting, and let's do a good job with those. These aren't intended to be stressful or super time consuming. Generally, folks have a good time with them. And if you follow the directions, it should be quite easy to meet and exceed my expectations for those. But if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them on the student question lobby or contact me via email. And like I said, I hope to catch up over spring break with the lectures. Module 3 is a little bit different. It's a 2-week module because there's a lot of content to cover. It's kind of the most content-dense module of this course. So I spread it out over 2 weeks. And along with that, so once Module 3 is done, we're going to have the first exam. So that's going to be the Wednesday after spring break. So keep your eyes open for that. And like I said, hopefully we'll have be caught up and you guys will have all the content so you can prepare for that exam. We'll talk a little bit more about the exam in the next lecture series. So for today's class, we're going to talk a little bit about ethical shortcomings and talk about the difference between relativism and universalism, and we're going to talk about ethical failures, mistakes, and shortcomings. And then we're going to talk about factors that influence ethical decisions. So we're going to talk about Kohlberg's theory of moral development, the 6 stages that are included in that. We're also going to talk a little bit about heuristics and bias and the conditions for rational decision making and why those conditions are rarely, if ever, met. And then we're going to talk about the cost benefits of heuristics. So what are the benefits that heuristics have, as well as some of the challenges that they pose. And then we're going to switch to talk about embeddedness of decisions. So we'll talk about individual factors with the stages of moral development and heuristics and biases, but then we're going to talk about embeddedness and how social, individual, professional, and organizational factors influence ethical decision making. So let's go ahead and get started. So ethical shortcomings. So we can define ethical shortcomings as instances in which conduct fails to meet the fundamental principles or habits of what we consider right and wrong. So it's when what we believe constitutes human welfare, so what is harmful and helpful to beings, isn't done. We can also think about it as a judgment of not doing the right thing. And so there's an interesting question that we can ask about the right thing. So this judgment of the right thing, there's a question of does context affect what and who who judges the right thing? So on one extreme, we can think of cultural relativism, and it's this idea that the right thing is determined by cultural context. And the example of that is using sex in advertising. So there's certain cultural groups and certain societies in which the use of sex in order to advance some economic objective is considered immoral, whereas in other cultures and society, the use of sex in order to sell something is completely normal. And under cultural relativism, we would argue that it's whether or not using sex in advertising is dependent on the culture in which it's occurring. So in the U.S., the use of sex in advertising would not be considered breaking any sort of ethical standard, whereas in Saudi Arabia that would be considered highly unethical. And we're okay with kind of seeing this differently across cultures. The expectation that we wouldn't want Saudi Arabia to tell us that we can't have sex in advertising in the same way that we don't force sex in advertising on Saudi Arabia. Now, the basic claims of cultural relativism, so the idea of why this is a logical way of understanding who and what determines what's right, is that the moral code of the context determines what's right or wrong. So the where it is occurring is what sets the boundaries, and that there are no moral truths that hold for all people all the time. That different histories, different traditions are going to lead to different understandings of morality. And that the moral code of our own society has no special status. That is only one amongst many different codes of conduct that is equally valid compared to others. And that it's arrogant for us to judge other cultures, that we need to be tolerant of different worldviews. Kind of getting to this idea of who am I to judge what is right and wrong for others. And this other question, do I want others who I may disagree with to make such judgments for me? So this is the kind of view of cultural relativism. We can also compare that to ethical universalism, the idea that there exists a universal standard of human behavior that applies to all people all the time, and that codes of conduct are absolute, undebatable, and universally applicable. So acting in any other way is a violation of what we might call common sense. These are rules that regardless of your history, regardless of your social context, that they make sense. And this is kind of based on the idea of the notion of descriptive realism or objectivism, that they're universal facts, and also building on that, the prescriptive realism. That they're universal values or hypernorms. And these might come from teleological theories of morality, so the idea of the objectivity of utility ratios, which is a way of saying that there are certain things that benefit people, certain things that harm people, regardless of the culture and society that they're in, and so that these apply universally. So, the cost to me of being murdered is the same, or is a cost regardless of what society I'm in. There's also, deontological theories, this idea of human rights, and that human rights exist, separate from any social or cultural interpretation, and that there's certain things by nature of being a human being that all humans have the right to, regardless of which culture or society they're in. And then we can also think along virtue-based theories. This idea that there are standards of character excellence that exist across all cultures, and that these norms provide us the basis from which to understand universal ethical standards. Now, there have been arguments that the use of ethical universalism is used, in ways that are akin to imperialism. The cultural intervention by one society over another in saying that this is ethical or unethical behavior, has significant negative effects on the local culture. And we can think of lots of examples of where ethics or morality from one culture have been used to justify the subjectification of another culture. This was very much, kind of the idea or the justification behind colonialism. Was the idea that Europeans were bringing what they believed to be the highest standards of morality across the world, and that it was in fact beneficial for the communities in Central and South America and Sub-Saharan Africa to be exposed and to have to be forced to live under the cultural norms of Europe. So there is a very long history of this idea of ethical universalism, being used in negative ways, which I think has prompted a lot of people to question the validity of ethical universalism and suggest that we need a more relativist perspective. For most folks, there's very much a dichotomy between those. This idea that we're either more cultural relativist or more universalist, that when we understand ethics, that we are either on one side of the continuum or the other. I would argue, however, that this is a bit of a false dichotomy. And that in trying to argue for one perspective or the other, in a similar way when we discussed capitalism versus socialism, that by kind of creating these ideological camps, we miss a lot of the nuance and subtlety. So, one of the interesting things when we talk about cultural relativism or cultural norms is, despite what might appear to be a wide variance in moral codes, there's far more agreement on values than disagreement across values. And we can look and see that there's a long list of core ethical principles that exist almost universally. The instances or examples of cultures and societies that don't value honesty, that don't value respect for others, or fidelity and loyalty, or fairness, occur in extreme situations, and typically they tend to exist in societies that are facing some sort of outside effect that is leading to this rejection of what are pretty much universal standards. Now, so there are examples in which extreme poverty, war, these sorts of rare and often unsustainable influences may lead to kind of a push away from some of these values. But by and large, the overwhelming majority of all societies and all cultures share many of the core ethical principles. So similarly, while we can agree it's hubris to judge others' values, we can make claims about whether or not beliefs are based on known facts. So, for example, if there's the Earth is not flat. There's demonstrable evidence that the Earth is not flat. There is no link between autism and vaccines, and that there's more variance within genders than between. So the idea of sexual discrimination, from a kind of empirical, known perspective, is difficult to justify. And so, I think this is an important point to kind of note, in that, it's one thing to say that the things that are the standards of behavior should be allowed to vary across the world. There do need to be certain kind of basic agreed upon facts that we all can understand to be true. And the challenge becomes when we start to disagree on these sorts of issues, because at that point it's very difficult to have any sort of logical understanding of what we're talking about. So if we're going to just start making things up in order to support our views, that's a very difficult place to have a conversation. Similarly, while we can argue that no single code has special status, we can't argue that some codes are better or worse than others. We can argue that the Nazi view of non-Aryan races is problematic. There shouldn't be any hesitation in sort of understanding that there are some moral codes and some ethical standards that are problematic. The challenge kind of becomes at the margins. So we understand, at the extremes, that there's certain ethical codes that are wrong. So we can understand that Nazi Germany, or slavery in the United States, or colonialism, from Europe, that these are problematic. The challenge is at the margins, and that's where I think most of the kind of more interesting discussion occurs. But that's not to say that there are some codes that aren't problematic from the get-go. And I think the other thing to keep in mind with cultural relativism, and this is a quotation from Christopher Hitchens, who's a great American thinker, and he argued that the problem with open-mindedness is that it can become empty-mindedness. And I would argue that for much of the recent American history, particularly since the 1960s, we've been very critical of conservatism and traditional viewpoints, to the point that we've discarded or devalued the ideas and morals that come from conservatism and tradition. And I think in some cases we've gone too far, that we've become somewhat nihilistic in our understanding of the world around us. So this argument that there are no universal human values is problematic. The argument that there are no objective truths and that reality is entirely socially constructed and determined by those in power is problematic. And the idea that any ethical value goes is also is fraught with all sorts of problems. And so I think when we think about this boundary of this dichotomy of universalism and relativism, I would suggest that we rather than seeing these as two extreme views, trying to understand that middle ground, and trying to understand the ways in which universal values exist, and the ways in which culture and context affect different value systems. So this judgment of doing the right thing, so the idea of ethical shortcomings is that they do come in different forms. So there's ethical failures, being culpable of acting on poor moral judgment in comparison to ethical mistakes. Because of reasons outside of the direct control of the individual, an individual makes a poor moral judgment. And there are also ethical dilemmas, which are instances in which there's an irreconcilable conflict between two moral requirements. So let's look at these each in a little bit more depth. So ethical failures, these are intentionally and egregious examples of violating fundamental principles or beliefs, what we might call gross neglect. And this is, socially, we understand this as evil. When we talk about evil, these are instances of clear ethical failure. And it's also, interestingly, what we call psychopathy. This complete uncaring for other people. And I would argue that complete ethical failure is quite rare. Although it's highly discussed in the media, it's often it's what our TV shows and movies are about. These purely evil people, and while they're interesting, while they're fascinating, I would argue that in real life we rarely come across clear examples of pure evil. It's not to say that it doesn't happen, and it's not to say that there aren't psychopaths out there, but it's quite rare. And I think the reality is, and kind of the truth of this class is that for folks that are evil, for real psychopaths, taking a business ethics class is not going to help. That there's other issues that they're facing, and so this is a little bit about what we talked about in the last lecture about the benefits of taking a business ethics class. And so if you truly are a psychopath, there's not a whole lot that this class can help you with. Now, when we think about what ethical failure entails, we can think about it as having the following traits. It's instances where there's an extreme asymmetry between the victim and the perpetrator. That you have a powerful perpetrator and a weak victim. The specific perceived attitudes of the perpetrator towards the victim's vulnerabilities. So this again speaks to the power, difference between a perpetrator and a victim. And then the other interesting thing with ethical failures are an observer's inability to recognize or identify with the perpetrator's motivation. So these are the kind of senseless acts of violence that we more easily understand or easily categorize as being evil. And if there's an inseparable judgment difference between the observer and perpetrator following the incident. So instances in which everyone else agrees that this is wrong, or that the benefits are have no clear understanding. Those are instances in which we would say that it's an ethical failure. Now, the There are instances in which we've seen ethical failures exist, and the situations in which they do happen are often precipitated by an objectification of victims that's not shared with others. And so this is, when we start to see, and we talked a little bit about this in the last lecture, when we start to see people as means to our own ends, when we start to identify, people as ways or as things to be exploited rather than opportunities. Or if there's a complete lack of empathy for victims, similarly to or related to this objectification, is that if you no longer have any feelings or any care for victims, that it's much more likely that you're going to do bad things to them. And this may be socialized, it may be rationalized, or it may be an instance of psychosis. Now, in business, where we see this happen is when we start to see, particularly in large organizations, when decision makers are so removed from the people in which their decisions will affect, that the people that are affected by the decisions are no longer human beings, or it's no longer communities, or it's no longer the natural environment, but simply numbers on a page. Those are instances in which we have seen businesses commit clear examples of ethical failure, in large part because there's this objectification or such an immense cognitive distance between the decision maker and the people affected that they no longer have any empathy for victims. So it's I would say that the kind of the one takeaway from this understanding of ethical failure as it relates to business ethics is that when you objectify or depersonalize other things or other beings, that you are at risk of ethical failure. But what's much more common in business management or business situations are what I'll call ethical mistakes, and these are unintentionally violating fundamental principles or beliefs. And so it's when, despite the best efforts, there are negative outcomes. And this might be due to a series of smaller judgments that collectively have outsized outcomes. It may be acting on what I'm calling bad information that the perpetrator should have known. And this bad information, gets to this objectivism or relativism. It's interesting that there are cases in which we think something to be true, and it turns out that that's very far from the truth. And kind of the greatest example of that has been all of the horrible decisions that were made based on the assumption that race has a meaningful and demonstrable difference on intelligence, and that because of that, that different races should be treated differently. And now what we understand about intelligence, what we understand about the relationship between intelligence and race, those sorts of conclusions are scientifically wrong. And so that acting on that has led to what we would call an ethical mistake. And so it's not to say that what people did was right or that it's a justification for what has happened, but we can understand how those decisions were made. And that relates to when there are weak assumptions, heuristics, or habits fail. That there's I believe that there are differences between men and women as related to work ethic, and so I'm going to treat women differently in the workplace. That's an example of a weak assumption. Ethical mistakes also occur when there's casual or careless neglect. And that's where I would argue we've seen most of the examples of what we call ethical transgressions are situations in which it's not that individuals didn't care, but that it was they had a lot of things on their plate, and it was difficult to know what was important, and so things that turned out to be important were overlooked. And there is an argument that can be made that maybe more attention should have been paid, but it's not out of any sort of intention to do wrong that these occur. Now, as I mentioned, ethical mistakes are much more common than ethical failures, but they're also far more complex, ambiguous, and equivocal. And we'll spend some time in a few weeks talking about complexity, ambiguity, and equivocality. But the kind of the lesson here is guilt is often not just a question of more information. And we can think of a lot of examples. So there's the Vale Dam collapse in Brazil recently, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, or the bankruptcy of Enron. What's interesting, at least in my experience, has been the more that I've learned about these situations, the more difficult it is to identify who is to blame. If we look at the Vale Dam collapse in Brazil, which led to the tragic loss of life, the company responsible for the dam was following what was understood to be the best practices of dam building at the time. That they had followed the standard operating procedures for building dams, and in fact, the company had their site headquarters, directly downstream from the dam. So clearly, they did not think that the dam was going to break. Similarly with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, there was BP lost a lot of money. And at no point can we rationally understand that British Petroleum or Halliburton or any of the companies that were involved in the oil spill wanted the spill to occur. And so, trying to understand who is at fault and who is to blame, what I would argue is a difficult question if we're just using more information. And we're going to have a reading in a few weeks, on the bankruptcy of Enron that deals specifically with this. And so the kind of the idea is that there's far less agreement than failures about what the ethical mistake was. And here in North Carolina, we're seeing this kind of play out in real time. With the effort for Duke Energy to pass on the coal ash cleanup cost onto its customers. And so, the interesting thing is that there's arguments on both sides about, whether Duke Energy is responsible for their coal ash waste, or whether, its customers are, and who should pay for that. The thing with ethical mistakes, and I think this is a bit of why this class is of value and of interest for all management students, is that these are not good people. These are instances of good people making bad decisions, and so what we're trying to understand is how can we avoid making bad? How can good people avoid making bad decisions in the future? With the ethical failures, if someone is narcissistic and wants to harm people, there's not a whole lot that we can do to help them. But good people that want to make good choices, and need the tools in order to make those decisions, I think this class can be very helpful. Now, finally, there are ethical dilemmas, and these are the what I would argue the most common ethical issue that folks in business face. And these are instances in which there are mutually exclusive and competing values. So when there's a decision point and you're only able to satisfy a single value at the expense of the other. And there are weak means of comparing and contrasting the outcomes, the effects, and the values themselves. And kind of the stereotypical example is the idea of stealing bread to feed your family. That there's the value of not stealing, and the value of providing for your family. And so when you're in this point, when you've got your kids are starving, and you have an opportunity to steal the bread, which value do you do? Is challenging. How do you compare, these two values? How do you compare the outcomes? And similarly, we can extend that to business, and the idea of committing accounting fraud to keep the business going. That there are a lot of values in keeping the business going. There are also values about being honest in your accounting, in your financial reporting. And so, how do you compare these two values? And again, I think what we see is instances in which good people make bad decisions, that ultimately, they fall on the wrong side. And the interesting thing is we don't hear about the people that fall on the right side, that make the right decision in these instances of ethical dilemma. We hear far more about the people that make the wrong decisions. And what I would argue that we need to watch out for is there is a tendency to argue that people that make the wrong decisions are somehow inherently flawed, that they have committed an ethical failure, when in fact the reality is that this is an ethical dilemma. And the reason why we need to understand that is because many times, all of us are going to face ethical dilemmas, and all of us are going to make ethical mistakes. And if we assume that the only people that make any sort of ethical shortcoming are evil or psychopaths, then we assume that we are never going to make we are never going to have an ethical shortcoming. And the reality is that's not true. And if we can understand and develop tools to make better ethical decisions, the likelihood that we're going to have, make the wrong choice with an ethical dilemma or make an ethical mistake are reduced. Now, when we talk about ethical dilemmas, I think this is kind of transitioning to our class a bit. Often we rely on tools in order to make the decision, and so there's tradition, culture, laws, and religion. And I would argue that unexamined tools may lead to worse outcomes. And that's, I think the example from society that we see is the Catholic Church sexual abuse cases. That the Catholic Church saw their role in society as being more important than the individual effects of sexual abuse by priests. And so there was an effort to cover up the sexual abuse because of fear of what that would do to the Catholic Church's moral standing in society, and the idea that the loss of that moral guide for society was more severe than the individual effects on boys and girls led to justification of the sexual abuse. And so there's an important need to examine the tools. And so it's not to say that we shouldn't be making decisions based on tradition, culture, laws, and religion, but we need to examine those, and we need to be prepared to question the value of these tools to make decisions. And that's what we're going to be spending the rest of this semester, is developing logical tools. And that's the main focus of the next module. And then the rest of the semester will be applying those logical tools to different contexts that businesses often face. And I would argue that, ethical dilemmas, if they're noticed, that's the greatest opportunity to choose to do the right thing. And the example that I thought of immediately, was this idea of hiring a high performer that's known to bully coworkers. And so on the one hand, there's this value of hiring good people in order to advance the company so that the company's successful, versus creating an environment that's safe and people feel comfortable coming to. And we see a lot of firms that are willing to hire a bully. They're willing to hire someone who's known as being a bully because they're a high performer. And what we see is that over time, firms that make that sort of compromise, or firms that choose the value of the firm's short-term success over an environment that's safe and welcoming, tend to struggle. Maybe not in the short term, but over time they begin to face a number of challenges. And I know this firsthand from looking at academic departments. That department that I was affiliated with, hired a known bully, but she was very successful in her research. And the interesting thing that happened is that over time, this kind of mediocre department, the entire department imploded, and was even worse off than they were before they had hired this high performer. And in the end, they would have been better off not hiring her. So let's think about how we make ethical decisions. So we've talked a little bit about this understanding of what ethical decisions and making the wrong ethical decision are. We've talked a little bit about the standards under which ethical codes can be judged, and so how do individuals make choices about how they act in order to meet these standards. And so there's one argument or one theory that Kohlberg developed, and his idea was that there's a sequence of stages of moral reasoning about right and wrong, and that there's these 3 different levels and 6 stages that individuals can be categorized in. And Kohlberg was not interested in the response of right and wrong, but he was interested in understanding the reasoning behind ethical decisions. So about how people justify behaviors, how people think through what should I do in this situation. And what he found in his research is that everyone goes through these stages sequentially without skipping any stage. So the idea is that if you are at stage 5, in order to get to stage 5, you had to go through stages 1 through 4. These are sort of hierarchical in nature, but the movement through these stages are not natural. So people do not automatically move from one stage to the next as they grow older, but rather movement occurs when a person notices inadequacies in his or her present way of coping with a given moral dilemma. So the idea is that as we face experiences and we recognize these experiences, that we can advance or further refine our moral reasoning. And then the other interesting thing with this theory of moral dilemma is that people cannot understand moral reasoning more than one stage ahead of their own. So the idea that a person at stage 1 can understand reasoning at stage 2, but they're unable to understand reasoning at stage 3 or stage 4, so it's an interesting way of understanding how people make decisions. So here are the 3 levels. So there's the pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional, and then the 6 stages. And so there's kind of 2 stages for each level. And we're going to go through each of these here. or each of these levels. So the pre-conventional morality, and it's the idea that judgment is based on personal needs or others' rules. And so in stage one, this is the lowest level of ethical reasoning, and it's based on obedience and punishment. So you obey rules in order to avoid punishment. That you determine a sense of right and wrong by what is punished and what is not punished. And that you obey a superior authority and allow that authority to make rules if that authority has the power to inflict pain. And that you're responsive to rules that will affect your individual physical well-being. Now in stage two, the naively egotistical, the individuals begin to understand points of view based on actions and how they serve individual needs. And so it's this idea of reciprocity. So I'll do something good, but only if I get something out of it. The idea that vengeance or an eye for an eye philosophy is this naively egotistical, and that everyone gets the same regardless of need, and that the ends justify the means. And so you'll do a favor, but only to get a favor. And so this is again somewhat the idea of what's been called enlightened self-interest. So this idea that if I do good things will happen to me. So I should do good things, but only because that means that good things will happen to me. And the problem with this is that it creates this expectation that every non-selfish deed has some sort of reward. And anybody that's been in a long-term relationship, understands the limits of this model or this stage of moral judgment. That we do things, more advanced stages of moral reasoning, in that we do things not because I gain something from it, but for other reasons. But at the naively egotistical or enlightened self-interest, you do good things because good things will happen to you. Now let's move to level two, in which judgment is based on others' approval, family expectation, traditional values, the law of society, and loyalty to country. So the kind of stage three, the good boy, good girl orientation. And this is about living up to social expectations and roles, and that the idea of being nice, and considering how the way I act may influence the relationships that I value. And so the idea of peer approval being very important, and then intentions are as important as deeds, and expectations to others. That a promise is understood to be the same as doing the act itself. So I promise not to hurt you anymore is the same as not hurting anymore. And you begin to put yourself in other shoes and think about things from other perspectives. Stage four, the law and social order, is when you begin to understand society as a whole when you're making judgments, and that you begin to understand that maintaining law and order by following the rules is necessary. And so this idea that I may not agree with the rule, but if everybody breaks the rules, then we're thrust into anarchy. The law and social order is very much premised on the idea of duty. And so the idea that rules exist to be followed. And so there's not much questioning about the rules, and that there's a respect for authority without questioning it. And that the idea is the majority or the kind of standard is the right way, regardless of any dissent. And the kind of the research, the psychology research, has found that about 80% of the world population kind of maxes out at law and social order. that most people in the world, when they understand or when they when we look at how they make moral and ethical decisions, we see that it kind of ends here with law and social order. But there are two more, or there's one more level, of ethical reasoning, which we might call post-conventional morality. And this is when morality is defined in terms of conformity to shared standards, rights, or duties apart from supporting authority. The standards are confirmed to an internal, and action-based decisions are based on an inner process of thought and judgment concerning right or wrong. So this is kind of an appeal to higher levels or more abstract levels of what's right and wrong. So murder, you begin to understand that murder is not, you shouldn't commit murder, not because if you commit murder you'll go to jail, not because it's against the law and it's against the rules or it's against the Bible to commit murder, but because you start to understand that there is a moral obligation, or that other human beings have a right to exist, and that taking away that right is wrong. And that understanding comes not from the law, comes not from what you're told, and it doesn't come from the punishment that you might get, but this understanding of higher order values. And so there's the legalistic social contract at stage 5 that accounts for differing values, opinions, and beliefs of others. And the idea that the rules of law are important for maintaining a society, but are not standards upon themselves. And so it's this idea that laws can be questioned, they can be challenged, and the way in which the laws were themselves formed matters. That an unjust law, or a law that was voted on simply by majority without consideration of the effects on the minority, is not a just law and should not necessarily be followed. And the stage 5 is the belief in that the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. Similarly, there's consensus rather than majority rule. And the respect, the rights of minorities, particularly the individual. And that change in the law is possible, but only through the system. And the final stage, stage 6, the kind of universal ethical principles, is based on the idea of those higher order shared ethical values that we talked about earlier in abstract reasoning. So we understand right and wrong based on those kind of the ideas of kindness, the ideas of trustworthiness, the ideas of loyalty, not because of any benefit that I gain from being loyal or any benefits that I gain from being honest, but because of an understanding of honesty and a belief in the value of honesty as a principle. And so the idea is that you follow these internalized principles of justice even when they conflict with laws and rules. And so the kind of the stereotypical example of this is Gandhi, with his civil disobedience, and the idea that following an unjust law is wrong, and that when there's an unjust law that you have to be willing to break that law, even if it conflicts with law and order. And that there are higher order moral principles than the social rules and customs, and that you're willing to accept the consequences for disobedience of the social rules, and believes that the dignity of humanity is sacred and that all humans have value. Regardless, and here's the key part, that all humans have value regardless of their material contributions. And so that a human exists, and a human has rights, and a human has value regardless of what I can get from that person. So it kind of disentangles the kind of labor from value. for human beings. And in many cases, it extends beyond human beings. This idea that that a lake has the right to exist regardless of the benefits that I gain from it. That a species has the right to exist regardless of the function that it plays in our ecosystem. And the argument is that there are very few individuals that operate at the universal ethical principles, these are kind of the true moral leaders of a generation. But I would hope that most of managers are operating on this legalistic social contract. And so that's, when we talk about the ethical frameworks in the next lecture, you'll see that we're building off of a lot of ideas that fall into that space. So now the important thing to remember about these different stages and different levels is that the environment in which decisions are made can moderate the stage of moral development. And so, what we can see is that because of environmental factors, someone who typically is operating at the stage 5 may actually operate at a lower stage, and in extreme situations may function at the lowest of stages. And so some of the things that we've identified that can negatively or positively affect an individual's ability to make a higher or lower level of moral reasoning include resources. So individuals have access to tools to make the right choice easy. So an example that I mentioned earlier, there have been studies that have shown that when employees have more contact with the customers that they're serving, that those employees tend to make higher order ethical judgments. And so, is it easier or harder to make the right choice? There's also the effect of demands. And so we know that in high stress, highly cognitively demanding jobs, that it can be difficult for individuals to make the right ethical choice. And so that, this question of is the cognitive load too heavy? Are we extending? Is the situation more or less difficult, and that we know that has an effect on moral reasoning. We also know that, interestingly, that exhaustion has an important effect on ethical reasoning. What we've seen, a lot of this research has been done in medical context, but we've seen that when doctors have had to do, a number of emotionally difficult procedures, that over time that their ability to make higher order moral judgments becomes compromised. And this has kind of raised the need, not only in medicine but in a number of different professions, that individuals need time to recover. That they need time to recover physically, they need time to recover cognitively, and that they need time to recover emotionally. We also know that transparency has an important effect on moral reasoning. So we know that if there's a potential for somebody else to find out about our decisions, that we're more likely to make higher order, or more likely to use higher order levels of moral reasoning than if no one will find out. And we can think about this in our own lives. The level of moral reasoning that I use to make decisions about how I spend my time when I'm all alone is much lower than if I know someone else is going to watch me or has the potential to see. We also know that perceptions of importance are critical. We know that the more important the decision is perceived to be, the more likely that people are going to allocate a higher order of moral reasoning. Incentives. Interestingly, incentives have a negative effect on moral reasoning. So the greater the incentive to do the task, the less likely I am to apply moral reasoning to that task. Authority. We know that the more powerful the authority figure, the less likely we are to question or to apply moral reasoning to that judgment. And similarly, conformity. And so the more people are doing a certain thing, the less likely we are to question it or apply a higher level of moral reasoning to it. And finally, there's issues of role conflict. So when there are dual logics that create confusion, that our ability to apply higher order moral reasoning becomes compromised. And so, instances in which individuals are thinking both as a parent and as an employee of a company, and if those two roles are in conflict, what we see is the ability to use a higher order of moral judgment is more difficult because the part of the argument is the cognitive load increases. That you're having to hold two different logics in your mind at the same time. And that's part of one of the reasons why we kind of advocate, particularly for high stress jobs, to leave home behind, and in part it's to reduce that cognitive load. So that's the kind of the idea of moral development and moral reasoning. But there's also interesting situations in which reasoning and logic get thrown out the window. And to kind of illustrate this point, this was a very it was a viral picture a couple years ago on the picture of the dress, and the question was, what color is this dress? And it seems like a very simple question. That should have a very simple answer, and theoretically we all should agree on the color of this dress. But the interesting thing is not everyone sees the dress the same way. There's some people that see that picture of the dress and see a white and gold dress, and there are other people that see that dress and they see a black and blue dress. And it's not that the people that see the white and gold are lying or are stupid or that they are trying to conspire against the black and blues, but it's what they see. And similarly for the black and blue. Now, the real color of the dress is black and blue. And the reason that I use this example or use this story is to show the ways in which there's a difference between seeing and understanding. And so when we look at something, what do we see? Do we see a material reality? Do we see a socially constructed reality? And I would argue that we see a mix of both that are influenced by our own state of mind. And so when we think about the color of the dress, we all understand and we all see the dress. And what's interesting is how we interpret and how we understand that dress differs based on with the dress situation. It's an issue of biology. So how many cones you have in your eye will affect how you look at how you see it. But the point is that this sense-making is an unfolding process of applying meaning to environmental stimuli, and that the real world is far too uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and equivocal to objectively know. So let's take this idea a little bit further. So in situations that the problem is clear, there is a single well-defined goal, all alternatives and consequences are known, preferences are clear, constant, and stable, that there's no time or cost constraints, and that the relationship between outcomes and inputs are clear, then a rational and objective understanding or decision is possible. And what that means is that You're able to establish important criteria for both the process and result. You're able to consider all the possible solutions and alternatives, and that you're able to calculate the consequences of solutions versus the likelihood of satisfying criteria for each alternative to ultimately choose the best option. And this is what economists might would describe as Pareto optimality. So it's when the best choice is selected, and there's all the other choices would either result in some loss at some point. So this is very much how, for a very long time, we understood human decision making. So the idea was that that humans make rational decisions, and that rational decisions mean that you're doing the cost benefit for all of the options, and you're choosing the best option out of all of these. But the reality is all those conditions, the likelihood that all those conditions are met is quite unlikely. I mean, in reality, there's probably never a situation in real life in which all of those conditions are met. So what we do is what we call satisficing. And it's the idea of selecting the first alternative that is good enough. And the reason we do this is it's a simpler conception of the world. It allows us to make decisions without having to determine all the alternatives and understanding all of the consequences. And typically, we make these decisions using rule of thumb, or what we call heuristics. And these rules of thumb in business, they often take the form of organizational routines, standard operating procedures, training, or what we can call filtering. So this notion of only paying attention to a limited amount of information rather than the full scope of information. And this idea has been advanced in social psychology. Also, this is the framework that's increasingly used in what we're calling behavioral economics. So the YouTube video with Dan Ariely. Dan Ariely is one of the big thought leaders in behavioral economics. But the idea has actually been around for a little while, and the premise of it is that human beings have two ways of understanding the world. There's kind of two cognitive systems, if you will, that are in place. And the first is what's called System 1. And these are the fast, automatic, effortless, associative, implicit, and emotionally charged decisions. And the idea is most System 1 thinking, in which biases and heuristics would fall into, can be difficult to control, but that's the primary system in which we operate in. Now there's also this System 2, which we might call introspective or cognition, and these are the decisions that we make that are slower, that we kind of make conscious thought and apply reason to, and these are the consciously monitored and deliberately controlled. And the interesting thing is that System 1 decisions we tend to actually have very little control over, but System 2 are potentially flexible and can be governed. So what the psychologists have understood is that most of the time we operate under System 1, which is monitored by System 2. And so the idea is that System 2 exists to correct misinterpretations of System 1. So the kind of the way System 2 works is that System 1 operates until System 2 says, hey, something's different here, something's not right, and then we rationally think about it. And so the System 1, the heuristics and bias, they're all sorts of different biases. And some of these are quite interesting to think about. This is only a partial list, but we can see that there are all sorts of biases that affect our decision making. And there's a reason for this. I mean, there's a very interesting benefit that biases provide us in terms of making decisions. The biggest one is speed and efficiency. That biases and heuristics are incredibly quick. And within the context of business and management, if you wait until you have the right answer, opportunities may pass you by. Similarly, using heuristics and biases, or these, the system one's thinking, is that it frees cognitive resources. That most decisions that we make in life are inconsequential, and so there's really no reason to allocate what we know is a limited resource of cognitive reasoning to. So what I eat for breakfast, if that becomes a heuristic decision, I'm not having to think about it, and I can think about other things that are more important. The other interesting benefit of heuristics and biases are for motivation and self-worth. So there's been some interesting work looking at various biases, and what we've found is if we knew how bad we really were at something or how unlikely we were to succeed, it's unlikely that we would ever actually do anything. And so these biases actually protect us and allow us to function in a highly complex and uncertain world. The other interesting thing with biases and heuristics, and some of the research that's coming out now about cognition and human decision making, is this recognition that there are lots of our parts of our body that think, and not think in the kind of cognitive, rational way that we think about thinking, but they think in the kind of heuristic and automatic way. And one of the super fascinating things, is that sort of thinking has a value. It has a benefit. So we talk about gut feelings. That I've got a bad feeling about this, or my gut's telling me not to do this. And one of the super fascinating things that we found is that there are instances in which gut and system one thinking is actually better at making decisions than if you rationally thought about it. So there's been some super interesting work looking at art forgeries, and what we found is that experts at identifying art forgeries are able to identify forgeries based on instinct more accurately than if they stopped and thought about and kind of did an assessment of whether it was a forgery. Similarly, we've seen with venture capitalists. So which entrepreneurs should they fund? What we found is that successful venture capitalists have what can only be described as a gut instinct for which ventures are going to be more successful and less successful. And so they've created this what we might call expert heuristic, or that some sort of habit that allows them to make better decisions than if they try and factor in all of the information to make a rational decision. However, it's not to say that biases aren't problematic, and they aren't problematic particularly when it comes to business ethics. So we can think about all of the biases that we may have and the problems that those biases may have in making decisions, making ethical decisions, and how biases may lead us astray. So it's not about getting rid of heuristics. It's not about eliminating these sort of automatic decision tools, but it's thinking about how we use these decision tools when we're making decisions. And I think the same would apply not only for individual heuristics and habits, but also external sources of information. So, how we make decisions based on religious teachings, how we make decisions using history, tradition, and cultural norms as a decision tool. So, what we want to do is reflection. So part of it is becoming aware of our own thinking. So what do I believe and what led me to that belief? How feasible is the counterfactual? What assumptions am I making about the world and other people, and how confident should I be in them? So again, there are certain heuristics and biases that make complete sense. But I do think that there is value in taking time to question these and evaluate them, and challenging them. If the counterfactual is plausible, what's to say that that is not in fact the truth? Now, the reflection is followed by inquiry. And so it's the thinking and reasoning of others. So kind of reaching out beyond yourself to ask, what do other people think, especially those that are likely to disagree with me. And so this is a way in order to assess our own biases, our own heuristics, and our own religious and cultural convictions. If someone sees something differently than me, why? Why do they see it differently than me? And then finally, this idea of advocacy. So this idea of making personal thinking and reasoning more visible to others, and this allows us to really test and challenge our own convictions about the world. So I'm going to upload a PDF, something that I have found particularly helpful in thinking about how I understand things and kind of the justification or reasoning that I use in order to understand the world around me. And it's the thou shall not commit logical fallacies. And so it's a list of gosh, I don't know, maybe 30 different kinds of logical fallacies or reason traps. And what I would say is I would encourage you to think about or to refer to this tool when you're making, when you're thinking about ethical decisions, and when you're thinking about reasonings or justifications for different choices that you make. So I think it's going to be a helpful tool for this class, for assignments, whether it's exam questions or the debates that you have to do, or your individual analysis. But I would hope that this is a useful tool, throughout your life, that you can refer back to. So we're about the 1:15 mark. So I'm going to stop this lecture, and I will pick it up in the second half here in part 2. So part 2 should be much shorter than part 1. We've got about 10 or so more slides left here.